Alright, gents, so really quick, I'm going to do a quick pre-presentation brief. So keep in mind, this is a presentation for one of my classes. So with that being said, I know we're in the military, alright, but let's try to keep comments PG-13 here, alright? So I know civilians have a little bit different language than we do, so just keep that in mind, alright? And then, are there any questions before we begin this presentation? Alright, fantastic. Next slide, please. Somebody, if you want to get that for me. Alright, so as you can see, my presentation is on prescription drugs and the military. Next slide, please. Alright, so the drug introduction and the importance of prescription drugs in the military. So, can anyone tell me what a prescription drug is?
I think prescribed by a doctor that you're able to take for a certain amount of time to deal with a certain amount of pain or rehabilitation.
Right, so it's any drug that requires a doctor's note or a prescription to legally take or legally obtain, alright? Next, is there anyone in this room that's currently taking prescription drugs? Exactly, so all of you guys, I was hoping that you guys might say that you weren't, but alright, so yeah, everybody in here is taking a prescription drug, right? We don't have the actual prescription for it, but we have an exemption. We work for the federal government. They mandate that we have to take doxycycline, which in any normal circumstances is a prescription drug. You are supposed to have a prescription for it. So the point I wanted to make with that is, you know, some people think about that and they don't necessarily know that they're taking a prescription drug. Or maybe somebody has handed them a drug that they thought wasn't a prescription drug. So anyway, and then why is the topic of prescription drugs important to talk about in the military? Any thoughts on that?
Excessive use, overdose.
Yeah, that's something that goes into it. Prescription drugs and like talking about them in the military, I think it's important because think about what we get harped on. So, again, when we go to the fleet, what do we get? What do we get talked about? Well, once again, what do we get harped on about when it comes to? What was that? Okay, sure, but so drugs and alcohol, right? So alcohol is like one of the biggest things that we have incidences with.
Oh yeah.
So
DUIs, especially DUIs.
right. So with that being said, I think we overlook a lot of things. You know, if we're focusing so much on one single drug, so like the main ones that we focus on are marijuana and alcohol. Granted that those two drugs do cause most of our incidences, but that doesn't mean we should overlook certain drugs like prescription drugs, for example, because we have them readily available to us essentially. And then what do people most likely associate with prescription drugs? What do you think?
Oxycodone.
Yeah, like
Narcos.
Oxycodone.
Alright, so
Hold on.
here I'm mainly looking for like groups of individuals. So what do people associate with prescription drugs when it comes to groups of people? So like types of people.
old people.
Right, so typically we're thinking about people that are older. So middle-aged people and then the older generation. When you think about prescription drugs, those are the people that are more than likely going to have those health issues. Alright, so we kind of skimp over the young bucks, right? So what's the general age of the military, most of the people in the military? About 18 to 25, 18 to 23, depending on the year, because obviously we fluctuate year to year. Some people get out, some people get back in, or some people stay in rather. So that's what people associate with prescription drugs for the most part, older people. So we get overlooked. Next slide, please. Alright, so should military personnel be worried about prescription drugs? Before I answer that question, I want to focus on two separate things. So I want to talk about Adderall first, and then I want to talk about painkillers. So does anyone know what Adderall is?
Yes.
What is Adderall?
Adderall is basically a drug that people that have ADHD or have a hard time focusing get usually prescribed it very easily. It kind of like just focuses you and you like, can't say it makes you feel better, but like it just focuses you and you have such an easier time focusing or getting the task done.
Alright, so correct. Adderall is what's known as a stimulant, right? Obviously, we're pretty familiar with stimulants. We drink coffee, we drink Monsters and stuff. Adderall is a whole nother level of stimulant, alright? It's a very potent stimulant. It's used, like Vegas said, to treat disorders like ADHD. Now, why does that concern us? It doesn't, right? Because in order to join the military, first off, you can't have ADHD or any attention deficit type of disorders. You'll get kicked out. And if you get diagnosed with it inside of the Marine Corps, you will get kicked out. You'll get med-sep. So, what am I getting at with that? I think that there is a supply issue. So, by that I mean, if there aren't any people with that drug, more than likely we don't have an issue with that drug. But what we do potentially have an issue with in the Marine Corps is painkillers, right? We can just as easily go into the doctor and be like, oh, my knee hurts, and then probably Doc upstairs, he's hooked me up before with, some pretty large ibuprofens before, that would typically need a prescription, alright? Instead, he's just handed it to me. Whether or not that's SOP, I don't know. But the point being is that I think we have a bigger issue with prescription painkillers potentially as opposed to stimulants or sedatives. Alright, so going back to the question of should we be worried about prescription drugs. So I'm going to go to my quote here. This is from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So overall, illicit drug use among active duty personnel is relatively low, and cigarette smoking and misuse of prescription drugs has decreased in recent years. In contrast, rates of binge drinking are high compared to the general population. So what that's saying is, what we get preached on every weekend as far as drinking being a problem, it probably does have some bearing, right? But like I said, with that being said, I don't think you should overlook prescription drugs because they are almost as available as alcohol and cigarettes, in my opinion, alright? Like I said, we can go straight into the doctor's office, right? We can tell them we have aches and pains, which we do, right? It's the nature of our job. I'm sure somebody in here has a backache. They could go to the doctor and get some painkillers, alright? Next slide, please. Alright, so why lower rates? Why has misuse of prescription drugs decreased in recent years in the military? Why do you guys think that is?
I think the Marine Corps has done an okay job at bringing this issue to light, and plus, I mean, everybody goes with alcohol, so I mean, it kind of just, it's either one, we're not looking at it, or like, it's very much easier thing to hide if somebody was doing so. I think so, and then, or that alcohol just shines a bigger light and kind of just dims out that.
Absolutely. So one of the biggest ways that the Marine Corps has mitigated issues like this has been through urinalysis, right? So if you think that you might pop on a urinalysis, you're probably not going to do that. What Marines and other DoD personnel didn't know is that they haven't even really been testing for prescription drugs since 2012, May 1st of 2012. So it's pretty recent that they've started testing for hydrocodone and hydromorphone, which is a pretty common painkiller used by DoD. Those rates have gone down because we've realized that there is a problem with those and addiction. So doctors have noticed that they've been prescribing it less, and they've leaned more towards painkillers like ibuprofen and such. Next slide, please. Alright, so experience. Does anyone have any negative or positive experiences with prescription drugs, specifically painkillers? I'm looking more for negative as far as experiences go in the military.
When I first got in, the guy, we got our wings together. He was, a drunk before the Marine Corps. I guess he couldn't drink because he was too young. So he had something wrong with his knee during flying because of G's and stuff. They gave him painkillers, and then I walked in on him snorting the painkillers. So it was kind of the weirdest thing in my life. So we had to talk to people. We had to do all this and that. It was just bad. But yeah, he ended up getting out because he just kept doing the same thing.
So Staff Sergeant's story is more on the extreme end. I do have my own story of prescription drugs. So when I was in Okinawa, about 2015, 2016, I was PTing, I ended up spraining my ankle pretty bad. So what I ended up doing as a young, motivated Lance Corporal, I went to my NCO, I told him, I said, hey, this is bad. And at the time I could barely walk. So I went to him, I said, hey, what do you want me to do for PT tomorrow? Because it was 06:30, and it was mandatory for everybody. He said, don't worry about it, I'll go to my room really quick, I'll come right back, we'll get it taken care of. He brought me 2 pills, alright. At first he told me it was ibuprofen, I was like, alright, good to go. So I took it, like he said, 1 hour prior to the PT that I conducted, felt completely fine. Like, I was on cloud 9, I was good to go. This is probably one of the best PTs I've ever had. The next day though, I woke up, and the pain that I had was substantially worse, alright. So, not only did he give me a prescription drug, and I had no idea that he gave it to me, but he also worsened my injury, right? Obviously that's not a good thing. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind those bad experiences, because those should follow you, and you should always learn a lesson from those. Next slide, please. Alright, so how do we prevent things like prescription misuse and addiction and the DOD? So these are all pretty common sense. I'll read a few off to you. So following the directions as explained on the label. Pretty easy, right? You gotta read it before you can take it. And a lot of times when you go to the pharmacist, they'll read it to you prior to even being able to give it to you, and you have to sign for it. So not a big deal with us. Being aware of potential interactions with other drugs as well as alcohol, right? So a lot of drugs will end up having synergetic effects. So alcohol, for example, if you take ibuprofen with it, does anyone know what potentially can happen? So if you take it with ibuprofen, you are more prone to things like stomach bleeds, so stomach ulcers, alright? So you can actually end up worsening things for yourself. Alright, next would be never stopping or changing dosing the regimen without first discussing it with your doctor. So if he tells you to take 1 a day, take 1 a day, alright? Don't double up, alright? Or at least if you feel that that's not enough for you, you can just call your doctor. If he gives you the A-OK, good. If not, he might change medications for you, alright? So keep that in mind. And then, like my story from Okinawa, right? So never using another person's prescription drugs, and never giving your prescription drugs to anyone else, alright? Just because you have a problem, such as an ankle sprain or something, and the medication was given to you by a doctor, doesn't mean that you can give it to someone else, alright? That can lead to arrest, and that's where my job comes in as an MP, right? So you can get arrested for having someone else's medication or taking someone else's medication, especially if it's a narcotic. Next, so storing prescription stimulants, sedatives, and opioids safely. So typically that's going to be found on the label as well. They're going to tell you how to store it and why you should store it and where you should store it. And then finally, proper disposal. Does anyone know how to properly dispose of prescription drugs?
Toilet.
So toilet is actually that's a very old thing, right? That's old news. Some will tell you on the label, yes, you can dispose of this in the toilet, but why can that be a potential issue?
It's chemicals going into the water, so I mean, I don't know.
Right. So right on the money. So it's chemicals going into the water, and you never know. Some places like when you go to the hospital, the Naval Hospital, they actually have boxes. You put those in. I don't necessarily know if they recycle them. I think some of them do. They'll check how the pills look and what the contamination level of them is, but they can reuse it, right? All right. So yeah, don't always just assume you can flush it down the toilet. All right. Always check on the label. Next slide, please. All right. So the future with prescription drugs and the military. Where do we go from here? Honestly, I don't necessarily know. All right. No one does. But I think that the Marine Corps has done a pretty good job with pushing out nicotine and tobacco. I think they've done a pretty good job at limiting some of the alcohol incidences that we have in the Marine Corps. At least they tell you, hey, think about stuff before you do stuff, especially with alcohol, right? So I think with more education on prescription drugs, like we're doing today, that we can also push this issue and other issues out the door. Next slide, please. These are my references. Are there any questions on my presentation? All right, thank you guys. Thank you, Staff Sergeant, for allowing me to do this training event.
Of course. 100.